You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We are joined again by Sarah Soule, a true crime aficionado and expert. She is joining us for a second episode on the murders of Cassandra Morton and Sage Smith. Sarah, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving me this wonderful opportunity.
We are so glad to have you. It's always good to have someone on board who is an expert, and you would certainly be categorized as such. I have learned so much about these cases from talking to you.
Oh, thank you. It's been about a decade's long worth of research and work, and I'm just glad to see this is only going to do Cassandra and Sage a service and expose more people to these cases.
We do hope that will be the end result. Last episode, we talked about Sage Smith, who disappeared and was presumably murdered in Charlottesville in 2012. Sage's body has not been recovered. I think we're still going to go ahead with the presumption that she was murdered. We do want to go ahead and shed light on another case, and this is from 2009, and that is the murder of Cassandra Morton in Lynchburg, Virginia. Sarah, about how far away from Charlottesville is Lynchburg?
If you take 29, it's about 70 miles from Charlottesville.
So not precisely the same neck of the woods, but close.
Close enough. It takes an hour and 15 minutes to get there from Charlottesville.
Again, not exactly next to each other, but still same area of Virginia. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about Cassandra Morton and her disappearance and murder.
Kristin, I found it interesting that you kick off when you sent me your notes about quoting an article that I quoted as well. And I would really like to start with that because there is so little, like I said, there's so little about her and her personality and who she was. So I found this quite good. Her mother, Catherine Morton, she's quoted as saying, Cassandra was a wonderful girl. She didn't bother nobody. She stayed to herself. She was her mother's best friend. They talked about all of her problems. But unfortunately, Miss Morton said she couldn't keep her out of trouble. Things got out of control. Cassandra started staying out late and hanging out with dangerous people. And her parents, they say they just couldn't get through to her. And Cassandra would often respond with, I'm grown and I can do my own thing. And her mother said, she's right. Once they're grown, you don't have the say like you used to, and you might not know things. That's basically all that's ever written about Cassandra's personality. There's a lot they usually mention her stepfather, Raleigh Myers, is quoted to have said, I don't think I can quote him precisely, but he said, she got too early with drugs and men. This is so sad to me. She was actually going to check in to a rehab 2 days after she went missing. She was going to check. She had a daughter. She was going to clean up her life. She was really excited to do, and she had this plan, and she was set up at the rehab, and then she goes missing and is later found murdered.
So Cassandra was 23 years old at the time that she disappeared, and as you said, it sounds like she was having a bit of a bumpy time.
It was a rough time. Also, she didn't have a stable residence, and she was drifting from home to home.
Sage's disappearance, it sounds like Cassandra was out on the street and then just vanished, disappeared. She was, however, found, unlike Sage Smith. Can you talk a little bit about the circumstances under which Cassandra's body was found?
Sure. She was found 5 weeks after she went missing. Her body was found 50 feet from the road at the foot of what's called Candler's Mountain. So it was cleared when I went down there, but it was wooded at the time. Mm-hmm. So she's found 50 feet from the road. I can't say that's a super secluded place, Now there's a store there on the corner of that road, but at the time there wasn't. She was dressed, fully dressed. She was very decomposed, unfortunately. It was cold. It was November. So she had on a coat, pants, and moccasins, which is how her mother identified her initially. And then they identified her through dental records.
So I imagine that means there was not much that they were able to find in the way of forensics. Is that correct?
Not at all, which is such a shame. I talked to the police again about that, and they just said the body was just so decomposed that they were not able to retrieve any DNA, recover any DNA, any cause of death. So there wasn't a crack in the skull or an obvious stabbing or bullet. Because of the way her body was when she was found, they wouldn't have been able to determine it if there was a broken hyoid bone, which is always indicative of a strangulation. They did classify her death as a homicide, of course, but no toxicology, nothing. We have nothing.
Yeah, unfortunately, with her body being exposed to the elements for likely 5 to 6 weeks between the time she went missing and she was found, it's really difficult for forensics to have anything to work with here. We found the same thing in one of the Colonial Parkway murders out of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer. They were also found approximately 6 weeks after they went missing. And it's shocking for those of us that are not scientists to find out just how much a body can be degraded and begin decomposing in what seems like a relatively short period of time of 5 or 6 weeks. There isn't much left there for the scientists to work with.
Exactly. And I feel like that's not my area of expertise. I know probably more than I should about, or maybe more than a normal person knows about decomposition and the process of that and animal
Yeah, same. I feel like that's the sort of thing that unfortunately all of us who are involved in the true crime space ultimately get. We get an education in things that maybe we would not necessarily want to have.
Right?
The interesting thing that should be made note of here is the fact that Cassandra Morton went missing and was ultimately discovered within a week of a case that received much more media attention and notoriety, and that is the case of Morgan Harrington, a Virginia Tech student who went missing after attending a Metallica concert. And Morgan's body was found not too terribly far away. And the circumstances of her death, I think, are, or at least you think, Sarah, are pretty similar to that of Cassandra. Would you like to get into the comparisons between the two?
Dumped outside. It's not very obvious where she is. It wouldn't be very obvious to the general public, but both of those women would have been found. Like the person, we know Jesse Matthew is responsible for the death of Morgan Harrington. We don't know who's responsible for the death of Cassandra, but they would have been found. And I think whoever did that knew. They tried an attempt at concealment. I need to talk about that too. She was found covered by large rocks and leaves, which is exactly how they found Morgan.
Interesting.
Yes.
Very interesting.
And it's worth...
And I can comment on that undoing, what Jim Clementi refers to as an undoing. When one tried to conceal a body in that particular way, or say even with a thorough burial of whatever kind, it is often indicative of a known relationship, and it is sometimes indicative of guilt, remorse. Not all the time, but I felt that should be mentioned.
And this Candler's Mountain location is 4.1 miles away from the Liberty University campus, where Jesse Matthew was attending school at that time.
Actually, Bill, he was working at that time. So he had already dropped out of, or rather transferred from Liberty to Christopher Newport, and then now he's working. Jesse Matthew is a marauder and knows that area and all around like the back of his hand. It's very interesting to me that campus originally owned that land, and that is a place where Jesse Matthew would have known.
And it's worth noting then that Jesse Matthew had been involved in sexual assaults and suspicion of sexual assaults at a number of schools and universities. He kept getting kicked out of various colleges in Virginia, despite the fact that he was a star athlete. He would be then transferred from...
He just runs somewhere else.
Do it all over again.
So The idea that, I know, Sarah, when you and I first started talking, the idea that Cassandra Morton might have been Jesse Matthews' first victim, or a test run, if you will, for what he would do to Morgan Harrington, not even a couple of weeks later. That is definitely something that, now that that idea is in my head, I can't quite get that notion out of my head. I know that there is no way to prove that Jesse Matthew is responsible for Cassandra Morton outside of him admitting to it, but that certainly is something that crossed my mind. And according to some of the reporting, it did cross the minds of the folks at Lynchburg PD. Can you speak to that?
To my knowledge, they have been to visit him, interview him about Cassandra twice. And they say now that they're not interested in him for that because they can prove that he was not in the area. I have no idea what the alibi is or what information they have that they seem to think is so solid. I really question that. Like you, Kristin, since I started digging into this, I can't get the Jesse Matthew, Cassandra, possible victim, possible first victim link out of my head. And I have tried. I've been really open. I am really open when I do investigations, and I don't have tunnel vision. And I really try hard to look at the big picture and to look at everything. And I have really tried to rule him out for this, and I can't yet. It's just, it's too striking to me. I also, a source of mine that she stopped calling me, and I think she got afraid or spooked. She told me that she heard Cassandra left in a cab, and she thinks it's Jesse Matthew. She was Cassandra's friend. I think a lot of them think it's Jesse Matthew. He wasn't driving a cab at that time. He was working for UVA Medical Center. There are some reports that say that Cassandra was seen leaving in a black sedan. Just had that one article on that says that.
I saw that article as well.
Is it possible that Jesse Matthew could have been driving for a cab company that also provided car service, for example? It is something he did do for several years.
That could be possible. And I also, cabs, they're not always yellow. They're all different colors. The car that they say she was last seen with or getting into could have been a black cab car or a black service car. Right. But I have to say that I haven't read that he was driving professionally or for his occupation on the side when he was working at UVA. I've never heard that. So I can't prove that. I will definitely go back and try to find that, or try to find anything I can.
But it is certainly very interesting that around this time period in this area of Virginia, we have young women going missing at a rate of at least one a year. And Jesse Matthew is responsible 100% for two of them. Morgan Harrington in 2010, Hannah Graham in 2014. I don't think it's much of a stretch that he could be responsible for Cassandra Morton in 2009. And I still think Eric McFadden is probably good for Sage Smith in 2012. But as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, Jesse Matthew was working at the UVA Medical Center as an orderly in 2012. I find that very striking.
I do too. I've always found this is his trolling area. Well, Hannah Graham was abducted by Jesse Matthew less than a mile from Sage, where Sage was last seen.
Worth talking about for a moment, I have read in some articles regarding Jesse Matthew quotes from some of Jesse Matthew's friends saying that they knew that Jesse Matthew was a predator and that he would seek out young women that were incapacitated and that
inebriated in some way.
That was definitely true in both the Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham murders.
Yes.
But some of those quotes said that he had a type, which is young, slender, blonde, intoxicated. I would have to push back regarding this whole blonde thing, because although friends did talk about the way he would prowl the bars in Charlottesville looking for women that were incapacitated and wouldn't know better about watching out for a sexual predator like Matthew, but the woman that he attacked several years before, which is the original DNA linkage that identified Jesse Matthew as a serial offender, she's not blonde. She's some sort of brown-skinned person They've never identified her, but I've certainly seen descriptions of who she was and what part of the world she was from. She actually returned to her home country.
To India.
She's not young and blonde. She's likely dark-haired and dark-skinned. So
Dark skin.
I think
It always angered me that they have just stuck on this thing of that he has it. And that's another reason why I can't get him out of my head as being possibly responsible for Cassandra. Is you're exactly right, Bill. His type is inebriated.
He's an equal opportunity offender. He's not.
He's an opportunist.
He's looking at situations and looking for young women that are not situationally aware because of their consumption of drugs or alcohol. Or
Hannah was inebriated, but also lost. So
right.
It's double.
And so he steps in and rescues them.
Yes.
And they may be in a situation where, like Hannah found herself, where she became separated from her friends and she was turned around, not exactly knowing how she was going to get home. He steps in. But I think the man is an equal opportunity offender. He's not just looking for a type. He's looking for a woman who won't be able to figure out that this guy's up to no good before it's far too late. And I think that his long history of serial rapes and murders, I think, extends to far more than just the 3 women that he's been connected to by DNA.
Bill, I've always believed that because in my mind, and I discussed this with Kristin off the air, but it doesn't really make sense to me that Morgan Harrington, because of what he did to her, because of how her body was, this whole ruse, first of all, that he played with her, back to how Morgan was found and what he did to her. It's just very striking, and I can't think of it as his first kill. I think that's a very common theory also in my community. Most people I've talked to from different walks of life also agree that Morgan Harrington was probably not this man's first kill, or at least not a first attempt. Because we know that RG, the victim that her name has not been disclosed, but the victim that you were referencing from Fairfax, the rape victim, we know that he was planning on murdering her.
Yes.
He just got caught. He got caught by the car lights, headlights.
Right.
He was doing awful things to her and was not just planning on raping her. It's quite obvious when you read her victim statement. He was not going to end with that.
Yes.
I think that, what you and I have mentioned off air, Sarah, the idea that you're seeing the evolution of a serial killer here. You go from Fairfax and then immediately to Morgan Harrington. I'm like you, I don't buy it. I can easily see where Cassandra Morton would be his first victim. Maybe that's because I want to see it. And because I'm trying to be very cognizant of the fact, according to Dr. Ramsland, that what you saw there is definitely a form of cognitive bias. And I don't want to fall into that. But I can legitimately see where a woman goes missing a week before Morgan Harrington does.
Because
found
he's not
in pretty similar
satisfied.
circumstances. Yeah. I don't think he got the satisfaction from it that he wanted to. I can see where it would be, okay, this wasn't quite what I wanted. Let me try it again. I can see it. But again, I'm trying to be cognizant of the fact that maybe I'm seeing a pattern because I want to see it. I don't know.
Kristin, I feel the exact same way. And I've been over this for 10 years, at least 10 years. And like I said, I do my best to not think that he had anything to do with Cassandra's murder, but it's impossible. And it is impossible for me to not still have that in my head. To not think that there's a probability that he could be responsible for this. Why not? I would like to just say a few things, though, in contrast about Cassandra and Morgan, and I will not get into the details of how they found Morgan. I just would like to say that in contrast, as far as with Cassandra, when they found Morgan, of course, they found DNA, blood, and semen. She's partially undressed. Clothes are everywhere. Her boots are taken, which is striking to me because that doesn't look like what happened to Cassandra. But if we go with what we were talking about off air that you were just mentioning, it could be that, yes, Cassandra was his first kill for whatever reason. He did not get to do the things he wanted to do and was not satisfied. And when he got Morgan, he was able to complete the act in every way that he wanted.
Yeah, I can see that, honestly.
I still don't think you could rule him out just because Cassandra happens to be dressed with shoes and no DNA is recovered. I don't think you can rule him out by that.
I agree.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. I've said this about Randy Taylor before, another murder suspect who has been convicted for the murder of Alexis Murphy and is a suspect in the Samantha Clark disappearance. There has to be something that Jesse Matthew wants or needs in prison that would be worth trading. I don't know what that is. In other words, we're not going to let him out of...
I haven't found what that is either, Bill.
We're not going to let him out of jail. And one of the things I struggle with, and Kristin and I have talked about this on Mind Over Murder before, it's so difficult for us to understand, but of course, I don't think either one of us is a sociopath,
No, definitely
that
not.
someone who's spending the rest of their life in jail as it is wouldn't want to do the right thing and perhaps lessen the pain of family members that are still looking for answers in their loved one's disappearance or murder. I think Kristin and I struggle with this because we still have a heart, I'd like to think, at least in my example. And it's not going to be enough to just go to someone like a Jesse Matthew and say, look, you're going to spend the rest of your life in jail, and then you're going to rot in hell after that. How about doing something righteous for once in your life and doing something that will help these people? I just don't think that kind of pitch for a Randy Taylor or a Jesse Matthew, or we can keep naming names here, I don't think that's going to work. But there has to be something that we could offer these people that would be worthwhile enough for them to say, yeah, I'll help you with that. And there's got to be something that these people who are going to spend the rest of their life in jail that they want or need.
I would still love to know what prompted Randy Taylor to finally give up the location of Alexis Murphy's body. I don't think we know that, and I would love to. That's something I'd actually like to ask Trina if she knew the circumstances of that. But something prompted him to finally give up the location of her body. I'm very curious as to what that might be and if that would work on Jesse Matthew.
And Trina and I had discussed this off the air several years ago, and I had said the same thing to Trina then. And again, I'm not saying I'm coming up with an idea that's never been thought of before. I'm sure our friends in law enforcement and his jailers have thought, can we work something out to provide additional information? Kristin, you're absolutely right. We still don't know why Randy Taylor came forward with the information about where the remains of Alexis Murphy could be found. I would maintain that it's quite possible that some of his other victims are likely in the same spot.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. I also find it interesting that right after Alexis Murphy's remains were found, they reclassified Samantha Clark's case from missing person or missing endangered to homicide.
Correct.
Boom, boom.
Which is very striking.
Bill, what transpired?
I don't know. They've not said publicly, and I understand law enforcement, they don't owe us an answer to the question, but both Kristin and I have talked about this quite a bit. Something has transpired there in terms of their conversations with Randy Taylor. And he appears to have provided information about where Alexis' remains could be found. And you're right, there was that reclassification.
So something has obviously happened with both of them. He's given up something. I can't say for sure, of course, but he has had to have given up something about Samantha Clark.
And Samantha Clark's family deserves answers.
They really do.
Her mother in particular has been waiting for all of these years for answers. And I don't think that her family thinks that Samantha's going to walk through the door tomorrow either, as we were talking about last time.
No, I know as much as I can about that case. And they drained a lake looking for her by my mother's house.
Correct.
They have searched bodies of water. I don't think that they have really done a very thorough job, or at least trying to look for Samantha.
Oh, I totally agree. It's difficult, though, when you're talking about a heavily wooded area that's quite rural, farms and fields and great swaths of woods. Randy Taylor was an outdoorsman, and although, as I mentioned a moment ago, it would be possible for him to hide bodies in the same location, certainly Jesse Matthew didn't follow that kind of pattern. He distributed bodies in various places.
Yes, and both killers, I knew from the get-go that these people almost had to be locals because these places, for example, Hannah Graham's, the site of her remains, the site of Morgan Harrington's remains, which is on a beautiful estate called Anchorage Farm. You had to almost be a local because you had to know that those places existed. I believe Randy Taylor is the same way. Bill, you're exactly right. He's an outdoorsman. He had a trailer out in Greene County, which is not far from Orange, which is actually where he met Samantha in a bar in Greene County. Anyway, then he moved all the way to Nelson, grew up all around here. This is a guy who knows the area.
And like Eric McFadden in the Sage Smith example, there's extensive cell phone contact between the suspect and a person of interest and the potential victim on the day that they go missing. And so they are the last, if not among the last people to speak to our victims.
Yes. And when you think about it, is Samantha, so Randy Taylor is her last call that they have on Samantha's cell phone. Is Samantha really going to run into someone else? Another monster?
I think not.
Yeah.
I think not.
I can't make that work in my head.
But we can do a whole separate episode, I think, about the probability of two serial killers working in the same area at the same time. And Sarah, that's something you and I have talked about off air, and it's definitely something that I want to bring up to Jim Fitzgerald. What are the odds that at this area of Central Virginia, within a decade of each other, you would have Mark Evanitz, Randy Taylor, and Jesse Matthew all trolling for women in this area between 1996 and 2014? The odds against that, many serial killers in one area, are ridiculous. And yet there it is.
There it is.
There it is. That's a whole, I would actually love to get a whole panel of profilers on to discuss that for an episode.
I have dreamed of that. Definitely. That would be absolutely great. And I'm really looking forward to what Jim Fitzgerald has to say. Anything, about that.
Yeah, no, I did pose the question to him as I'm going to call him our in-house profiler. I did pose the question and said, what are the odds of this? And I'm guessing that his response is going to be the odds are astronomical that this would happen. And yet somehow or another, we do end up with 3 distinct serial killers working the same area in Central Virginia. And that's got to be terrifying for anybody, honestly.
It was mind-blowing. It was initially, to me, just so overwhelming that this could even be happening. It makes no sense. It's unbelievable. It is terrifying.
It definitely is.
I was laughing for a moment there because I was thinking that Jim Clemente is going to be sending us a nastygram saying, I thought I was your in-house. We've been lucky enough to meet some of these amazing people who've been incredibly helpful to us. And one of the things Kristin and I like to do is learn as we go along, and we hope that we can take our audience with us as part of this journey of developing an understanding from all these amazing people. But I think
maybe I'll send it to Jim Clemente as well and see what he has to say.
I guess it's
I would love that.
Whoever has time.
Whoever's got the time, exactly.
And if I'm not mistaken, they were in the same graduating class at the FBI
At the Academy. Yeah, absolutely. I want to make sure before we stray too terribly far into how many serial killers can possibly be in Virginia at any one time, the answer, of course, being a lot. I do want to make sure that we go back to the conversation we were having last episode about this concept of missing white woman syndrome. Because as we can definitely agree, Sage Smith did not get the kind of treatment with her disappearance and probable murder as, say, Morgan Harrington or Hannah Graham. I think we can definitely agree that Cassandra Morton did not get the same sort of treatment either. And I think it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but I think it's one that it can't be ignored any longer.
One thing that's really striking is that we have Cassandra Morton and Morgan Harrington going missing 6 days apart in a relatively close area. Charlottesville versus Lynchburg, 70 miles apart, as we talked about. The differences between the level of coverage between the Morgan Harrington case and the Cassandra Morton, at that point, disappearance is striking. There's just, here we are again with an African-American woman from a lesser economic status. Her stepfather said the Harringtons can afford a reward to find their daughter's killer. We're poor and black. Nobody cares, said Raleigh Myers, her stepfather.
Yes.
The differences are remarkable, and they are both in major cities in Virginia, Lynchburg, and Charlottesville, larger and perhaps a bit more of a media center. But Cassandra Morton gets essentially very limited coverage. Without criticism, Morgan Harrington gets wall-to-wall coverage for weeks, if not months.
It's very disparaging. I initially went into Cassandra because it so upset me. Looking at what happened to Morgan with the press that she got, with the media attention that they got, looking into Cassandra, really wanting to figure this out, and then just being hit with roadblocks because either the reports on her are all conflicting with certain details. It doesn't seem to line up. Everybody is reporting something different, and there's just so little out there. It's just such a shame. Why should we care if Cassandra Morton had a drug problem? Why should we care if Cassandra Morton hung out with too many men or whatever was going on? We shouldn't care about kind of life she was living, what race she is, how much money she makes, how much money she came from. She's a murder victim. Everyone, white, black, Hispanic, all races, if you go missing, you need to be all treated the same and with as much dignity, respect, publicity. We need to be doing everything we can do for every victim, but whether that be a disappearance or a disappearance and murder. It's so sad to me. Of course, I understand it when you look at it culturally, socially, but as far as just being a human being, I just find it's an outrage. And I can't believe we haven't learned and that there hasn't been a sea change with this. More people are talking about it. More people are writing about it. But it doesn't seem like anything has changed. With Gabby Petito, for example, the nation was just wrapped up in that whole thing forever. And I'm so glad that Gabby got the attention that she deserved and that they could help that transpired and they could solve that and everything like that. But it's just remarkable imbalance just because someone might not be petite or blonde or white. I don't understand it.
We did start hearing a whole lot more of what people have called missing white woman syndrome as a result, like you said, of the Gabby Petito case. But it certainly isn't the first time that has come up in our cultural conversation. I just don't think it stuck the first time around. When I was doing research for this episode, I saw referenced in one of the pieces about Sage and Cassandra, a column from Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson, with whom I know you are familiar, Bill. He wrote a column called Damsels in Distress. And this was after the Jessica Lynch case in 2012, I believe it was. And I wanted to quote a little bit from this because I think it speaks to exactly what you were just talking about, Sarah. So this is an excerpt from Eugene Robinson's Damsels in Distress column. Quote, "A damsel must be white. This requirement is non-negotiable. It helps if her frame is of dimensions that breathless cable television reporters can credibly be described as petite. And it also helps if she's the kind of woman who wouldn't really mind being called petite, woman with a good deal of princess in her personality. She must also be attractive, also non-negotiable. Her economic status should be middle class or higher, but an exception can be made in the case of wartime. See Jessica Lynch. Put all this together and you get 24/7 coverage. The disappearance of a man or of a woman of color can generate a brief flurry, but never the full damsel treatment.
There's a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist and an African-American man writing with great power and precision exactly what's going on. He called it Damsels in Distress. And this column is about 10 years old now.
Yeah.
But as usual with Eugene Robinson, he's out on the cutting edge in terms of his thinking.
Very forward thinking.
He's nailed this completely. This is exactly what we're talking about. Damsels in Distress is a little bit of a throwback title, which he's entitled. Now we seem to be calling it Missing White Woman Syndrome. And I think he has described it to a T. Again, no disrespect to Gabby Petito or anyone that goes missing.
Sure.
But the amount of crazed 24/7 cable coverage that we saw on the Gabby Petito case, it's just unheard of, but she checks all the boxes. The one thing I think that makes me feel a little bit better, Sarah, is that at least we're talking about it.
Yes.
Kristin and I are talking about it on Mind Over Murder with you today, and we've seen a lot of other true crime podcasters, authors, television hosts, and so on, at least thinking about it and trying to do something to adjust some of their coverage. And as we were talking about off air, there are certain cases, JonBenet Ramsey's my personal favorite, where I'm just so tired of hearing about the same cases over and over again. Again, no disrespect to the Ramseys. I'm just using that as an example. Given the fact that we have 250,000 cold case homicides here in the United States, there's plenty of people, missing people and murdered people that we need to be talking about. I just think we all need to be making a significant effort to make certain that we're talking about people that aren't just pretty and blonde and, dare I say, petite.
Exactly.
I'm glad. I concur, and I'm so grateful to be able to discuss this with you both today. I wanted to say I am impressed with the movement, if I may be so bold as to call it a movement, that seems to have been taking place within the last few years as far as the missing and murdered Indigenous women of Canada.
Yes.
That's really impressive.
Yes.
And I wasn't even aware of that, or Highway 15 or
Highway of Tears. Yeah.
Highway of Tears. Thank you, Kristin.
Yeah.
And they have really, there's just a lot more advocacy about that now and a lot more awareness. So I would very much like to think that we're making progress, but that progress really seems to be slow moving.
It definitely does. And it is definitely to the detriment of families like the Mortons and the Smiths, who do not have the benefit of coverage of their loved ones' murders. We are hoping in our way here as a podcast that we can help to shed light on those cases, because it's inexcusable what happened to them and the fact that they were not able to get the kind of coverage that they needed and deserved it's just not right.
There are some bright spots. I think the establishment of the Black and Missing Foundation by Derica and Natalie Wilson, two sisters, and we were lucky enough to meet them at CrimeCon. And they're on a list of people that we really admire, that we would like to reach out to ask them to come on to Mind Over Murder and talk to us about the incredibly important work that they're doing to highlight the fact that it isn't all just young, skinny blondes that go missing across the United States, that there are all sorts of other people, a rainbow of missing and murdered people that we need to be talking about and we need to be covering. So I see some movement, as you were saying, Sarah, and I think that's a good thing. And Kristin and I have a list of people that are on a wish list that we want to reach out to and hopefully be able to engage them in a conversation. And I think that is something that should be moving up closer to the top of our to-do list.
Yeah, agreed.
I agree. And the Black and Missing documentary on HBO.
Yes.
I was so grateful to see that. I love them. I love those women. They're amazing. I follow them also on Instagram and I try to read every post. We need them so much. I think it would be great if you could get them on.
Well, we hope so.
Yeah.
We hope they'll have the time. But we had a chance to chat with them, and we both just thought they were so amazing. And then, of course, they won major awards that evening at the Clue Awards at
The
CrimeCon.
Clue Awards? What are the Clue Awards?
This is a new thing that they did for the first time at CrimeCon, trying to highlight worthwhile television series, podcasts, books, and other media that are highlighting crime victims, families, and investigators, forensics experts, and other folks that are moving the art and science of solving cases forward. It was actually a very impressive first-time event.
I was referring to it as the CrimeCon Emmys, but I think that's maybe a little disingenuous of me. There are clearly much greater conversations to be had, much more extensive conversations to be had about missing white woman syndrome, as well as other cases that we would like to highlight, but we're going to have to save that for another episode. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Mind Over Murder. We will see you guys next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.